on? Great. So thank you for joining, everybody. This is really a pleasure to have you all, and very happy that our authors are also here. I'm Radhika Iyengar. I am at the Center for Sustainable Development at the Earth Institute, Columbia University, focusing a lot on climate education, working with some scientists on fluoride mitigation work. So my work is mainly at the Earth Institute to be working with some of the scientists on microplastic, fluoride, and bringing in the education element into how we can educate more informally, formally through the work that's going on at the Earth Institute. That's one of the work that I do. But the Center for Sustainable Development, Earth Institute, Columbia University has organized this book series. We at the center work very intersectorally. We have a health team, we have a infrastructure team, we work with the engineers at the engineering school. So it's very much an intersectoral center, and we wish that many governments follow our way of functioning, where they work collaboratively and intersectorally. But that's happening. I see that happening quite a lot these days. So having said that, I just wanted to start this discussion by a very serious note. These are very difficult times, and a lot is changing and happening around us. Politically, we've seen a lot of unkept promises previously by the COPs, ever increasing environmental disasters, reaching every home and every continent by now. And as well as now we are recovering from the pandemic, and many of us forget that the pandemic is a climate disaster in its, at least from its origins. So our book, Christina and I co-edited this book during the pandemic, again, a very difficult time for all of us. The book, I'll send the link online. It's great that thanks to Simona, our UNESCO IBE colleague, she's been able to make this book freely available online. So everyone can download chapters. The entire book is available online. It's called The Curriculum and Learning for Climate Action Towards SDG 4.7 Roadmap for Systems Change. So we are looking at the potential of SDG 4.7 to bring in a transformative change. My co-editor Christina and I often discuss about these roadways that we are, prescribing in our book, and how are we trying to overcome the 5 roadblocks that Christina had written earlier on. So is the book really looking at the pathways that we can forge to cover those roadblocks? So let's get deeper into discussion about these roadmaps and see how we can use education, or the role of education in mitigating a lot of things that are happening around us because of climate change. So handing over to my colleague Christina. Maybe Christina, if you can say a few words about yourself, introduce yourself, and then we can get into our discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Radhika. Hi, everyone. It's so great to see so many different faces from all around the world. I think it's testament to the global climate crisis that we're facing today. My name is Christina Kwok, and I am an education consultant and research director at Unbounded Associates, and I'm also a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution. And as Radhika said, we're really delighted to kick off our author series. We'll have a couple of these over the next few months. Featuring some of our 44 different authors who contributed in the midst of the pandemic some really incredible chapters to help us begin to think about ways that we can address some core roadblocks to education in this time of climate crisis. So I don't want to spend any time rambling right now. I would love to introduce our 2 authors who have joined us today. Who will spend a few minutes giving a brief overview of their chapters. And then we'll go into a discussion with them. And please feel free to think about questions that you'd like to ask them. If you would kindly put them in the chat after we go through some initial questions, We'll, highlight folks to ask their questions, to unmute yourself and ask your questions to the authors directly. We'll do that in a little bit. But yeah, so, okay, let me get started. So our first author who is with us today is Dr. Chirag Dara. He is an assistant professor of environmental studies at Creagh University in India. He's formerly a climate physicist with the Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology and is one of the authors of India's climate change assessment report. Got a climate scientist in the house with us today. And he, together with Vandana Singh, a professor over at Framingham University, authored a chapter called "The Elephant in the Room: Why Transformative Education Must Address the Problem of Endless Exponential Economic Growth." And his chapter, his and Vandana's chapter, is situated within part 2 of the volume, which is really trying to address a core roadblock around a lack of radical vision within the education sector around climate action. And so this section of chapters really tries to address kind of some of the core issues underlying that lack of radical vision. So he'll speak about that in a moment. And then our second author who is with us today is Pravindaran Balakrishnan, who is currently a secondary school teacher at Padang Midin National Secondary School in Malaysia. And he has spent some time overseas and abroad in the US as well, as a Fulbright student, Fulbright scholar, studying in Loyola University in Chicago. He has authored a chapter called "Education for Sustainable Development in Malaysia: Challenges and Strategies." And his chapter is featured in part 5 of the volume, which seeks to address the roadblock around how our education systems are not empowering our teachers to be the change agents for sustainability and climate action that they can be. So we'll hear a little bit from him in a second. So I'd like to turn it over to both of our authors. We'll start with Chirag to provide sort of a few minutes overview of your chapter with Vandana and Pravin, your chapter as well. So we'll start with Chirag. I'll turn it over to you now. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Christina. Thanks, Radhika, and thanks to everyone here for being here. And after we talk a little bit about this, I'm really looking forward to the discussion. In fact, I think Johnny Roberts, is that the same person who was at the ICSD? I've been wondering since your name popped up. Regardless, so about the chapter, in our chapter we've discussed the problem of this imperative for endless economic growth. Regardless of the level of affluence of a country, of a people, and so on. The problem is specifically that economic growth has gone together with our use of physical resources. So as the world economy has grown, and it's grown exponentially, so has our use of physical resources. And by that, I mean all physical resources. We talk about metals, we talk about plastics, we talk about construction ores, biomass, land, water, everything that's available to us on this planet. And that really is, without sort of going into too many details, that's fundamentally the reason for the twin and big problems, anthropogenic problems of climate change and the ecological crisis. So the problem is much larger, of course, than just climate change. It's a problem of pollution. It's a problem of the ecological mass extinction event that we are precipitating. Now, we actually know this. I mean, a lot of people sort of who think about these issues, they are well aware of this. So why is it in the face of this kind of these crises, multiple crises, are we still insisting on ever increasing growth, even among the most affluent? And there comes in technological optimism. So the idea generally is that as technologies improve, and they will improve, we will be able to decouple economic growth from the use of physical resources, including fossil fuels, but not only, all physical resources. So increasing efficiency, substitution, and substitution of one resource for another, and so on. And what we've discussed in this chapter is that that is highly unlikely to happen for very basic physical and mathematical reasons. Both Vandana and I are physicists and mathematicians, so that's kind of the approach we took in our chapter. So let's talk about solar PV. Yeah, so there's a physical limit to the efficiency of a solar PV panel. You can get about 35% efficiency. So 35% of the solar radiation incident on a solar panel that gets converted to electrical energy. You can, even theoretically, you can never exceed that. And in practice, it's tough to beat 20% efficiency. The point being that if we think in terms of solar power, of course, that's a great thing. We need to electrify, we need to go to solar and wind. But solar energy requires a lot of land. The amount of the energy density of solar and wind is much lesser than fossil fuels. So for the same energy out, for the same power output as a fossil fuel plant, you need a much larger land area of solar or wind power to produce the same power. But now one might argue that you can make it more efficient, but the physical limit really kicks in, where you can never make it more than 35% efficient anyway. And because of economic and pragmatic considerations, getting even 20% or more is very difficult. And so you hit this limit, so you have no option but to expand the size of your solar power plant. So that involves the amount of materials that I use, the mining, the land grab that happens in very many places. Wind power, same thing. There's a very stringent limit to how much wind power a wind turbine can convert out of your wind energy into electrical energy. In fact, the conversion is so inefficient, it's only about a 50th or a 100th of the efficiency of a gas-fired plant. Okay, so these are some technological, I mean, there are others, but you're kind of getting this is the drift. And this is what we discuss. And so what we've discussed is that there's a fundamental contradiction between the SDGs. The SDGs have been critiqued for very many reasons. And one of those is that SDG 8 is this demand for perpetual economic growth, which is without any sufficiency constraints, which is without any notion of sufficiency at all. And that is in contradiction with SDG 12, which talks about responsible consumption. Now, given that SDG 4, specifically education, is meant to enable sustainable development, quote unquote, there is a fundamental problem between what SDG 4 is saying we need to educate for, and the fact that there's a fundamental contradiction in, how do you educate people for basically a fundamental contradiction within the SDGs? And so if you want to take a transformative sort of education, this vision of transformative education, we need to acknowledge that there is this fundamental contradiction between the economic imperative and the sort of the physical constraints that we face. And we haven't gone into a lot of details about how education and so on, because personally, I'm more of a physicist and a climate scientist than an educator. So the point of our chapter was pointing out that transformative education really, it requires us to confront these fundamental limits and to address them. So sorry if I've taken up too much time, but thought I would leave you with that.
Thank you so much, Chirag. I mean, you point out this incredibly important contradiction. And I think that that's something that when we talk about sort of education's role for climate action, we assume that there is some, level of sustainable development that can be achieved and still kind of keep going as business as usual. And I think, you raise this point, and it's critical for us to begin to think about, what does transformative education look like if we are really trying to transform those underlying systems and structures, and including this kind of contradictory set of goals. So now we'll turn it over. We'll come back to you for some questions, Chirag, but first we'll go over to Pravin now to provide a brief introduction to his chapter. Pravin?
All right, thank you, Christina. Thank you, Chirag, and also thank you, Radhika, for this opportunity and also this platform. So I'm a teacher. I teach English actually at a secondary school. So I teach students age 13 to 17. So climate education is something which is always overlooked, especially in schools. especially in Southeast Asia, especially in Malaysian schools. I can't speak for Southeast Asia, but I believe it's a similar pattern. So at the current juncture that we are in, climate education is something extremely necessary for our students because they are the future. And in the case that we are in right now, especially like in terms of Malaysia, education is structured in a way where it focuses on global and economic competitiveness. And based on my personal observation, being in the classroom for the past 7 years, I've been teaching for 7 years now, and also through the documentary analysis that I did for this research, I came up, there were like 3 challenges that I identified, like why climate education, the obstacles faced by climate education to be enforced in schools. And the first biggest challenge that climate education faces is the dominating role of exams, especially in the case of Malaysia. I mean, most countries have different education systems, so I can't speak for those countries, but in the case of Malaysia, examinations play a very, very big role. And when this happens, what happens is the teachers, they teach according to the syllabus that what will be that will be tested for the exams. So climate education or climate change is not really tested in exams. So teachers tend to focus on natural sciences like physics, biology, and chemistry, and they do not look at climate education at all because it is not really tested in the exams. So this is one of the biggest challenges that schools are facing. The second one is the top-down nature of the Malaysian education system. I think in most countries in Southeast Asia, the education system is a top-down system, meaning the central government has a lot of control what happens in the classroom. And this is one of the biggest challenges as a teacher being in the classroom, because you need to teach according to the syllabus and you need to teach according to the curriculum. And they have there's a lot of accountability tools which forces you to teach in a certain way. And I mean, there are also opportunities to veer off and do something cool with the students or something really groundbreaking, but most of the times it's very heavily rooted back to the exams. So the top-down nature of the education system and the dominating role of examinations, they actually come together, and this really somehow, I would say, limits the teacher from actually exploring new topics. And the third challenge is a student outcome. So in this case, I mean, research on environmental education in Malaysia has been carried out for a bit, and most of the time, most of the research points to one direction, where students do not have environmental awareness, and that is a big problem that we are facing. I mean, this is 2021, and when it comes to environmental education in Malaysia, it is still revolving around switching off the lights, using the recycling bins. It's still very very backdated, and that is also another challenge. So in light of these 3 challenges, I propose three strategies to push for ESD education for sustainable development in Malaysia. The first one is to empower teachers. To be the main drivers of ESD. The second one is to tailor ESD to fit the Malaysian education context. And the third one is to broaden the current Sustainable School Environmental Award. We have a competition like this in Malaysia. It's a national competition. It's called the Sustainable School Environmental Award. So that was one of the strategies I also mentioned in my chapter. So very briefly, one of the things that I realized while doing this research was teachers play a big role. Teachers play a big role in pushing ESD, and teachers should be empowered, should be given projects, and they should also be given the autonomy and agency to carry out environmental-based projects in the classroom with their students. And this is something which I feel that that Malaysia can do better. And next, interestingly, Malaysia has a subject called it's called sustainability. That is the name of the subject when it's translated to English. And this subject is not part of the main curriculum. and it is one of the electives, and it is barely and students barely take this subject because they do not see how it will help to improve their scores in the university for university application. And when I went through the syllabus of this subject, it's called sustainability. It really covers a lot of things about sustainable education and also about the environment. But unfortunately, it is sidelined, and not many students take these subjects. And the students that take these subjects, that take this subject of sustainability, are usually lower ranked students who are not academically very strong. So that's also another problem with the Malaysian education system. And um, to sum up, one of the main things which I discovered writing this chapter and doing this research was to really see how, to really understand the role of the teachers. And the pandemic really reflected this as well, because when the pandemic took place, especially in Malaysia and also many other countries, teachers played a very big role to ensure learning kept happening. So yes, so that's the sum up for my chapter. Thank you.
Radhika, go ahead.
Thank you, Christina. I think that was a fascinating overview of both your chapters, Chirag and Praveen. We have a lot of participants here, so maybe I'll ask my question and Christina can ask our questions very quickly, and let the participants also ask their questions. Meanwhile, if you can type your questions down, or if you would want to, it's a small group, so maybe you can also raise your hand and we can, ask you to ask your question. My question to Chirag, in your chapter and yours and Vandana's chapter, you discuss this idea of inherent tension between growth and SDGs, as you mentioned. I feel that they were in Brundtland Commission report 1983, I think. It was mentioned there will be this tension between sustainability and growth. It's been so many years. Obviously, they didn't call it Sustainable Development Goals at that time. Then, around 2015, Pope Francis, with his Laudato Si encyclical, also mentioned that there is, resources are limited. We need to be careful. But why isn't anyone paying attention to this? Is economics the only driver, and is limitless growth that important for us that we continue? Do you think it is a first world issue? Do you think that there are many countries who are grappling with this idea of growth, and they want to have GDPs as their main drivers, and sustainability is a second alternative? What is the tension here, and why have we not progressed with this, even with this language, over the past couple of decades? My question to you, yeah, then I can ask question to Praveen later on. Chirag?
Thanks, Radhika. Very pertinent questions. You've raised multiple points, so I hope I cover them. If not, please just refresh my memory. So, in fact, I think Limits to Growth was the title of the Club of Rome report. It was at 1972. So it goes back a long way, this discussion. In fact, recently there was this study by someone surprisingly at PricewaterhouseCoopers, if I'm not mistaken. Someone among you probably remembers. And she basically put together the data and traced out which of the scenarios that were discussed in the Club of Rome report back in 1972, which of those trajectories do we appear to be on? And it turns out we are on the one of the worst trajectories, business as usual, which in fact, and we've traced it almost exactly. That's what she did from just putting in hard data. And that trajectory is leading to a collapse by 2040, by the 2040s. So that's where we are. And this has been known a very long time. Personally, I think what has happened is there's been a divergence between science, people, and economists. Yeah, in the science, in the the literature is full of discussions on the climate, ecological crisis, all of the anthropogenic crises. Yeah, people's movements, particularly in the last 3 or 4 years, the Fridays for Future Extinction Rebellion, they are not just asking for climate action, right? They're asking for systems change, not action on climate change. And systems change, of course, comes down to the economy. I do think that there's been progress. It's just not for very many reasons, including that it's inconvenient to folks with the economic and political power. It's inconvenient for them to recognize these contradictions between this tension between growth and sustainability and action on these crises. So I really think, in fact, that when we talk about education, we need to start with our engineers and economists. With all due respect to engineers and economists in the audience, but engineers with their focus on technological solutions and economists with their focus on this endless economic growth, I think that's where we need to begin to re-educate them. And that sounds really creepy when one puts it like that. But really, I think that is the imperative. As to whether it's a first world issue, firstly, I don't. I think those choice of words are probably not the ones I would choose. But what I would say is, I think it's a problem of affluence. And in fact, it's not just me saying it. There's a whole paper called "Scientists Warning on Affluence," which came out, I think, either in 2021 or 2020. I think it came out a few months ago. And they really trace anthropogenic crises to the fact of super affluence. The argument is really not difficult. Affluence, which you're well beyond your needs and you're well into your wants. That luxury consumption is what's usually resource intensive and emissions intensive. And there you go. That's what's causing the problem. And the top 1% causes a huge fraction of emissions and resource use and so on. So I think it's a problem of affluence, super affluent countries and super affluence within developing nations. That's a fact as well. I mean, India has uh, multiple billionaires, and it's ironic given otherwise the per capita income in this country and their standards of life, their sort of their environmental footprint is as high as anywhere else. So it's super affluence, which is the fundamental problem that we need to address in terms of equity. I mean, how is another matter, but in terms of the imperative for what needs to happen, that's what I would point my finger at. Was there another point that you raised, Radhika, or did I sort of?
I think you added on to what I was asking, Chirag. So maybe I'll ask Christina, maybe she'll cover some similar questions for you first before we go over to Praveen.
Yeah, I think Chirag, what you're saying really gets to the need for us to talk about education beyond just the facts. And I worry because, at COP26, for example, the UK Secretary of Education launched their newest or the latest or only climate and sustainability strategy for the education system there. And in that draft strategy, they've stated almost literally, that climate education should be about the facts and, not about, the deeper political agendas or systems, political systems that might be structuring our current realities with the climate crisis. So what you're speaking about is really quite a radical vision for education. I mean, it's saying we need to confront the contradictions of our economic systems, our values around economic growth. We need to address affluence. We need to, be self-aware and turn a reflective eye on our own lifestyles and our own, ways of being in the world. And I don't think every education system is, and let alone every educator, is ready to implement such a critical approach. I mean, again, looking at the UK's recently launched strategy. So what are your recommendations for seeing this kind of education scaled around the world? Like what needs to be put in place first or done first, second, third, and so on? Like help us think about, what we can do to really begin to head towards that direction, because you're right in terms of, we can't educate our way out of this crisis through a facts only approach. We really need to begin to understand these contradictions and the systems behind it. So talk a little bit about that.
Honestly, Christina, I don't think I'm the right person to talk about it very well. As I said, I'm not so much an educator as I'm, you know, someone working in climate science or other related topics. I think I'm gonna do what everyone does when they don't know how to answer the question. I'm gonna skirt your question and answer the question that I would like to answer, right? What I think what I would rather do is to point to a couple of examples, which is that New Zealand has, you know, sort of formally chucked GDP as the primary indicator for the economy, for the health of the economy, and chosen to focus on well-being. Now, what this happened last year. Now, what that means, or if anything will fundamentally change, remains to be seen. But the fact that it has happened in one small country, in a very sort of one corner of the world, literally, it does mean that there are folks taking notice. So that is some cause for cheer. I take some comfort in that. There are other countries that have done some very interesting things. So Ecuador, for example, has this rights of nature built into the law. It's built into the constitution. And in fact, the other day I was talking to an environmental lawyer from Ecuador, very interesting person, and they've actually used this law to fight mining operations. And they've used the idea that you're violating the rights of nature, not the people living on the land, but of nature. And they've actually won in court. So there are means of there have been certain, these are of course what I'm aware of. There are probably very many other initiatives in different parts of the world. Of course, whether they are scalable is a question for all of us. I'm sure many of you here must be aware of other such initiatives, but I do take some comfort in the fact that some of these changes are happening in a few pockets.
Thank you. And I mean, your response is also a good reminder that we can't follow a linear path to transformation either. We can't follow a 1, 2, 3 kind of step approach, but it's actually, you know, looking at holistically, what are all the different levers in society that can help us get there, right? So whether it's laws, like the ones that you just cited, or if it's other kind of entry points within our system. So it was a good side swipe and then a reminder around about the need for really a systemic approach to our kind of shift towards a more radical approach to education. So now I'll go over to Pravin and ask just a brief question to you. And I mean, you talk in your chapter about, you know, the need to, you know, really address the top-down structural issues, the culture of the education system in Malaysia, the empowerment of teachers, which we have an audience question on as well. So we'll get to that in a moment. But I'm curious, from your perspective, what are your recommendations for Malaysia to potentially unlock some of the resources, the funding, the opportunities to strengthen some of that kind of systems change, capacity movement, given that it is so top down? I mean, you spoke about the award, for example, the sustainability award. That is one sort of example of a top down attempt to create bottom up incentives. So maybe talk a little bit about kind of what you see as some key opportunities that Malaysia could take as a very centralized education system to help begin catalyzing some of these more systemic transformations.
Yeah, all right. Thanks for the question, Christina. So, so I have been thinking about this. Like, I think like around 2 to 3 years ago, there was this big thing about coding, like teaching students how to code. Like coding is like one of the skills for the 21st century. And what the government or the Ministry of Education did was they put coding as part of the syllabus, but more interestingly, what they did was they created this grassroots initiatives where they call it the STEM Association, STEM as in Science, Technology, Engineering, Mathematics Association, and teachers became heads of it, and they had like each district had like one hub, and what they did was these hubs took part in competitions. They shared resources, and they also had a lot of knowledge sharing process where a teacher head or a teacher who's highly competent in coding would share the knowledge with other teachers, and then hope that the other teachers would start similar initiatives with their students in the school. So I was thinking, like, one thing like the ministry can do in such top down constrained environment, which the Malaysian education system is, they could come up with such hubs for climate education as well, having each district appointing maybe a geography teacher or someone, or a highly competent teacher, to lead those things within a district, and then hope that it just spreads out. So there's one thing that I think the ministry can do, and also like provide funding for teachers to carry out projects, and then use these projects as models for other teachers to also to do in their schools. So there's also another thing that the ministry can do, because the way the system is structured is like all the whatever directive, it comes from the top. So there needs to be like what you said, Christina, there needs to be like some kind of bottom up incentive, and so that there needs to be this like decentralization as well. And the best person or the best people to drive this would be teachers, not principals, definitely, also not district officers. It will be teachers on the ground with the students. Yes, Christina, I think that answers.
Thank you, Praveen. I think it answers perfectly and is a segue to two questions that I want to ask. One is from Good News, asking a really good question on teacher empowerment. So you presented one model where teachers could become the hubs of, these localized entities. But the underlying question here is also what you commented on, that sustainability is not something considered to be very cool, or like, you will be, one of the topmost subjects that students can take. So how do we change that culture, and then what are the other ways of empowering teachers? Because usually we hear teacher training, this, that, but I feel sometimes I see around me that the environment teachers are actually teachers who are teaching other subjects, music, English, and they are not being given the training that the ESD teachers need to have. So I don't know if training is the solution, but creating these hubs could definitely be, I think, one of the solutions that you're suggesting to empower teachers. But any other ideas on those two, value based on ESD as well as teacher empowerment?
All right, thank you, Radhika. So I think one, coming back to the to the question from Goodney. Thank you for the question. I think I was also thinking about this, right? Like, as a teacher myself in the classroom, like, if I were to teach climate education, and I teach the final year students, if I were to teach like something on climate or something related to the exams, I would definitely choose to teach something related to the exams, because they'll be tested for that and they need to get a high score for that. So I think there needs to be like this radical structural shift, and the shift should be, I mean, it sounds really boring to say this, but the shift should be on the assessments. Like, what are we assessing our students, right? Like, there should be like a climate dimension to that, like a climate education dimension to that. So to answer Goodney's question, um, of course, it'll be great to empower teachers and for them to bring in climate education to the classroom. But at the same time, the government or the Ministry of Education plays a huge role, especially like in a country like Malaysia and most countries in Southeast Asia, I can say. So there needs to be like this where like this case where um, climate education becomes a compulsory subject for all students. Now that is very authoritarian, I would say, and also like very uncool, and also not very imaginative. But with the current situation we are in, if we want something really quick, I think the best way would be that, like, make climate education compulsory. Like, every student has to take it, just like how maths is compulsory. Like, our understanding with nature should also be something compulsory. And I totally agree with what Katarina just said. Like, cross-curricular approaches are the best. I just very quick. I was an English class, but once I taught my students how to do sandwich in the classroom, and they were so excited because they were able to cook. So we can also do something like that, because and these were all male students, and they were excited to cook something that day. From 14 years old male students doing sandwiches, they were so excited. So maybe we need to do something like that as well for climate education. Yeah, I think that's my bit.
Thank you, Praveen. Any other questions from the audience? Chirag has a question. Chirag, do you want to ask your question?
It's actually to everybody because my impression is, from what I remember, Italy has actually done this. And incidentally, Maria, I found that you said you wrote here that it's happened in Canada. That's amazing. Haven't seen the link yet, but hasn't Italy also done that? I think somebody probably knows.
They have recently mandated, and it's under the guise of how do they say it's like a green civics education. They've put it within a broader frame, but it is a climate change and green civics learning or something like that. But I believe that this implementation has been stalled because of COVID. It was supposed to be begin in 2020, September of 2020, I believe, but schools were closed. So I don't know if others know of any progress there. That's sort of the latest state that I'm aware of.
Well, and I'll just speak in the Canadian context. Education is a provincial jurisdiction, and so it's quite uneven. There's a lot of conversations happening. We had a big research report that was done by Ellen Field, who's spearheading a lot of that work here in the Canadian context. But youth are, I left a link because young people in some provinces are the ones who are really pushing for the change, and they have. This is what I'm finding. My own doctoral research is looking at how teachers are enacting climate justice in ways that are attentive to youth well-being, because we're seeing this intersection of crises. But it's youth who actually have a very sophisticated understanding of climate justice and want to see these kinds of shifts. And we're seeing that kind of public education of the youth climate movements are really starting to push within the systems. And so those are really important lever points for change.
Maria, question for you actually. I think this, we say no child left behind. I think now we should be saying no school left behind, because the students, the youth are leaving the schools behind and getting themselves educated from everywhere else. And the schools are lagging. So I think we need to be keeping up pace with the students and saying this is what they need. Let's change our system. Like, I don't know what top-down approach we are waiting for when the students want something else and they are sitting there not getting what they are wanting. Is that some education that we are trying to, what is it that we are doing in the schools? So otherwise, in the curriculum, if you do a curricular analysis, in most of the countries, there is no climate reform, no climate justice related issues. We don't do a proper treatment because of so many other things going on. But students are learning about climate reforms elsewhere. So how do we bridge this gap, and what can we do to our current systems to make that change happen? Any examples from your end?
Was this for me? I wasn't sure if I heard that, or I wasn't sure who you were asking.
Just based on your experience, yes.
Yeah. Well, I definitely think that, again, like any systems change, you have to really do a multi-pronged approach on the lever. So it's going to take, the curriculum reform. Yes. It's also I'm doing a lot of grassroots work of coaching educators, trying to empower them to create community. I think teachers want to be doing this work. A lot of teachers want to be doing this work. And they also know that there are these gaps. They feel the urgency. A lot of teachers are parents. So, they have this dual role of understanding that more needs to be done. And I do think that really building communities of practice, helping them connect with others so that they start pushing, because I do see the classroom as a site of transformation, a really profound one. And so I think doing what we can to support teachers is one of those levers. Yes, we're going to need top down. That's true. But at the same time, tomorrow, a teacher could go in feeling empowered with community, feeling empowered with resources, and they will start to do that work, depending on, of course, how rigid and stringent their context is. So I say that, you know, knowing that is certainly a factor.
Thank you so much, Maria.
I'd love to jump in here on this point, because I think it builds back on to Pravin, your chapter, Chirag and Vandana's chapter as well, at least where it heads towards the end of the chapter, and Goodney's question, really around kind of, you know, what does empowering teachers look like? And in many ways, you know, I feel like what we sort of come back around toward is the need to really bring political agency into the classroom, discussions about, you know, how to civic engagement. It leaves sort of the, you know, facts only kind of classroom setting to one that is much more about engaging, you know, in democratic processes. And this, in many cases, you know, education can be, you know, a very political tool, and in which case political leaders would be the last ones in many cases to promote such a political education. And so given, you know, especially like, you know, in the context of Malaysia, such a heavy top-down structure, heavy accountability system. I mean, we could say the same thing in the United States, but more of a decentralized top-down structure, and still heavily accountable to testing and so on. You know, to get to the kind of discussion that Chirag and Vandana have pointed out in their chapter. I mean, there is the need to really bring back civics, bring back, you know, bring political agency, bring, you know, a different set of learning outcomes into the focus of education. And I would love to hear from not only our authors, but also others in our Zoom room, you know, how, if you've seen any sort of steps forward when it comes to kind of re-examining assessment systems, teacher positionality within the classroom and in the broader education system towards, you know, these climate outcomes that we're all seeking.
Silence in the room. We have a lot to think about. Looks like transformative education is not there yet. We need to bring in all these aspects together. Praveen?
Yeah, I'm just going to quickly add to what Christina said. I think teacher positionality is a huge factor. And this comes back to what Maria also said, like when a teacher goes into the system, from my experience, I think a teacher is deprofessionalized, and a teacher is also de-skilled in many ways. And by the time the teacher reaches a few years, the passion in the profession is diminished. And when it comes to something like climate education, the teacher has to be very highly passionate about the topic. If not, it's pretty difficult. But if the teacher is given the agency and the autonomy to work, and also I don't want to use the word respect, but I would say, given the level of professionalism that a teacher the teacher has, and if all of this is there, climate education is something very doable in the classroom. It's very doable. And to be fair, like what you said earlier, Radhika, our students, like my students, they are really, they have a connection to all of these topics, because they learn these things, they come across these things on social media. They are aware of all of these things, but in the classroom this does not take place. So there's a disengagement over there. Yeah, so that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Praveen. I think Katrina raised her hand, and then Maria. Katrina.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Christina, thank you so much for the question, and kind of happy about that I can't answer it, and I'm going to explain why. So I'm based in Germany, and we, I think also by the UNESCO, we were a lot of times very long concentrated on the students' or learners' competencies, and then at some point moved on to the teachers' and educator competencies. So what I observe here in Germany is when, for example, the measure or we don't have indicators for ESD in schools. Why I'm saying this is that it's not really part, so you can do whatever you want. I'm saying very cautiously. I think we are more and more moving towards that, because what I thought about, if our mandate in school is to prepare our students for the future, then crisis and dealing with crisis is one of the main competencies we should give place to, but not only the learners, also the teachers. And two things I would like to share here is, I think I really like the Praveen, what you said about teacher competencies. And when you tackle that the best person or best change agent is actually the teacher, I think peer-to-peer learning and building a network amongst the teachers, this is what works. I think, like, we have a lot of papers, we have a lot of research, this is all necessarily, but in the classroom setting, this does not matter that much. It matters what Praveen does in his school. It would be interesting for the teacher here. And this, I think we need to foster much more. The second thing is what I just, I think I lost it. Maybe I'm gonna write it down in the chat. I lost the second point, but maybe it was not that important because I lost it.
Thank you, Katrina. I think very important points. Peer-to-peer learning goes back to, there's a comment on community of practice, creating that hub that Praveen mentioned earlier on. I think those are really important points that have not been looked at carefully. I think there needs to be a lot of research as well as a lot of practice to learn from in the first hand. Thank you, Maria.
So my point was, I actually have been a teacher, and I started teaching about climate change 20 years ago. And I was actually confronted by a parent who worked in the extractive industry. I'm in the Canadian context, and brought their tome of research to my classroom and said, you need to teach both sides. That disinformation campaign that, Michael Mann and others have documented was very real. It came to my classroom 20 years ago. I kept persisting. Even though I felt vulnerable as a teacher, I kept persisting. And then I was, of course, accused of politicization, upsetting the children. Right? So all of those things I experienced as a teacher, trying to push this space, push that site of transformation in my classroom. The reason I've left the classroom now to move into doctoral work is exactly this, around supporting and harnessing teacher leadership. And building those networks, because I experienced in my own microcosm, the challenges. And I would even pursue educational spaces that allowed me more agency. And I still experienced a lot of challenges, right? Like, I went to more alternative schools or spaces, that talk about human rights, and still this was an issue. And this is why I moved into the work that I'm doing now, is to actually crack that open, contribute to cracking that open, because I think teacher agency and leadership is just this powerful resource waiting to be harnessed. And I do think when teachers come together, they really will become very critical agents of change on systems change.
I'm just floored by what you said, Maria. I mean, that is exactly the fear that I have when we put together this volume and we're talking about really needing to push for a bolder, more radical vision for education. And really, that there, in many ways, Chirag talks about these physical limits that we have in our planet, right? And I feel like there are political limits within our education systems that just at some point we just can't press past beyond, because I mean, for opposite reasons from planetary boundaries, but just the nature of politics and education really begin to hinder our ability to leverage education for the systems transformation that's needed. And I think that that's something, to definitely leave us with some thoughts to continue to noodle on. And something for us, to really consider, how do we engage in the kind of systems transformation that in many ways does not threaten, but does push back against the very structures that are enabling our crisis to unfold. Katerina, I see your hand is up. I don't know if you had a comment that you wanted to come in with. real
Yes,
quick?
because Gudni's question in the chat in the beginning, I find it super important. Gudni, your question was rather we should empower the teachers to act in classrooms now, or to actually empower them to lobby. If I may comment, I think both is important, but looking at the climate crisis, to wait till the system will change, we don't have this time. So I would go for both, but I would strongly engage the first one just to, in order to able to act now.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Katerina. So I'm just looking at the clock and cognizant that this is our hour is up. And I hope that you all found our discussion today with our two authors to be a thought-provoking and a good start or an end to your Friday, as Pravin is already in the evening and where Pravin is located. But it was a delight to have you all here. We would highly encourage you all to continue coming to our upcoming series. We'll be sending links around with the registration times and dates for those to hear from more of our authors. And again, for those of you who are interested in reading the full volume, the link, we put the link in the chat a little bit earlier, and we'll be sure to do so again in just a moment. But please do join us again, and a virtual round of applause to Chirag and Pravin on their chapters. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.